Okay, Luke 21, starting off here in verse 5, it says, some of the disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. By way of introduction, what would you do on your very worst day? I mean, the day when you got nothing left, but all you can do is just cling to your faith. What do? This text is all about equipping Christians, believers, to remain faithful in the darkest of days, the darkest of times when everything seems stacked up against you. This is what this text is really about. It's not as much a litany about what's going to come in the end times. That's what a lot of people think. It's more or less to bolster and strengthen Christians to endure the tests that will await them in their life. So Jesus wants to both warn us of upcoming trials, but then also uplift us and encourage us to remain steadfast as we cling to the promises of God. So starting off in verse 5, as you look there, some of the disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God. And then Jesus tells them that, all of this stuff that you're admiring, it's really going to become rubble. It's all going to be a pile of junk here in not too long. It's all going to be thrown down. And it's hard for us in our day, I think, to truly appreciate how alarming Jesus' words would have been to the disciples. It's hard to imagine what they would have meant to them in that moment. One moment, the disciples are, stammering at how beautiful and how awe-inspiring the temple is, and the next, they're learning that God's design for this space is to trash it, to destroy it. And the temple, it was magnificent. Let me just share that. A succession of Herods, so Herod is more like a title, if you're unfamiliar with that. Kind of like Caesar is a title. There's lots of Caesars. There's lots of Herods. There's Herod the Great. There's Herod Antipas. There's Herod Philip the Tetrarch. There's lots of Herods. So there was a succession of Herods. 20 years even before Jesus was born, Herod had began to renovate the temple. And that renovation lasted 84 years, all the way up to 64 AD. So 80 years of temple renovation. So when you hear the disciples standing in awe of the temple, it wasn't the temple that Ezra and all of them were kind of, had mixed reviews over because it wasn't as beautiful as Solomon's temple. The whole temple was being renovated, and so it was beautiful. It had become the crown jewel of the nation and a symbol of hope that one day God would liberate his people. And so this is really where the shock comes in, if you can appreciate it. He says, as for what you see here, a time will come when not one stone will be left upon another, that every one of them will be thrown down. I don't know if we have an equivalent in our society to what the temple meant to the Jew. What's the equivalent for an American? What's the temple for us? What? The White House? The White House, yes, exactly. Maybe the White House is our equivalent. For Israel, the temple was a beacon of hope. It was the place where the real presence of God dwelt with the nation. It was also the place where heaven and earth overlapped, kind of like Eden. And so it was also the place where their children were dedicated, even from an early age. Centuries of worship took place there. This was God's earthly throne room. And so the announcement of it being destroyed would be pretty devastating news for those people. Maybe the closest that we have in America is the White House. Maybe that's the closest analogy. And I guess if Jesus announced the destruction of the White House, then we would probably be pretty alarmed, pretty worried. In fact, in the movie Olympus Has Fallen, anyone seen that one? It's actually what happens in that movie. The president's held hostage, and basically the White House becomes a war zone. and is eventually destroyed. Not remembering that right off the bat. It's great for movies, but does that really have the purchase of this text? Maybe it does, I think, actually. The White House is a symbol of our republic, and if it was destroyed, it might symbolize the destruction of our nation, our republic being destroyed. If the White House was destroyed, you could imagine that the anxiety of our nation would rise to alarming levels: insecurity, fear, recession, and war. And a host of other bad things were surely going to follow. If you can imagine that, you are on the road to understanding what the disciples would have felt at the news of the destruction of the temple. Let's get into this a little bit more. They said in verse 7, "Teacher," they asked, and you can understand why they're asking, "when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to take place?" Okay, that's the context. The context is super clear, okay? The context of what follows is an answer to the question, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to take place? When will these things happen? What will be the sign? This is a specific question now that Jesus is answering, not to satisfy their curiosity, but to prepare them, again, to remain faithful. Now, if Jesus said today that, hey, your White House is going to be leveled to the ground, it's going to be flattened, the first question I think I would have is not why, although I'd be interested to know that. I kind of have an idea. But maybe when? When would it be? You know, maybe I've got government treasury bonds and I want to cash out before, this whole thing goes down. We'd like to know its future. Is it future Brian's problem, or is it like current Brian's problem? I need to know. Start hoarding toilet paper again, or, sorry, bad joke, too soon. Verse 8, it says, "He replied, 'Watch out that you are not deceived. For many will come in my name, claiming, I am he, and the time is near. Do not follow them.'" It's interesting to note that even in Jesus' time, sometimes we hear of the herald campings these days that are announcing the end is near these days, but of course herald camping has passed. But there's new ones that come up. In Jesus' own time, it was such a time of great hope, and people were anticipating that God was already doing something special in the world. And so there were more than one person, even in Jesus' own time, that were raising up, proclaiming to be somebody, in other words, a messianic figure or some sort of a prophet, and leading people into rebellions against Rome to hopefully fulfill that messianic promise of liberating Israel. Even in Acts 5, you might want to pencil that because I'm not going to read it, but Gamaliel, who was one of the famous Pharisees, even now, Jews regard his teachings. The famous Pharisee, he named a few messianic wannabes of the day. He noted Theodas, who rose up and was killed, Judas, who rose up and was later killed. And so those are just a couple of notable men who claimed this kind of messianic role in Jesus' time, when Jesus was either on the scene or before Jesus was on the scene. And so Jesus notes that after his ascension, that more of these people are going to rise up who are going to proclaim sort of this messianic role or this prophetic role. But don't believe it. Don't believe it, because when Christ does return, it's going to be in glory and power. First he came humbly in a manger as a child. Later he will be coming on a white horse, commanding all of the hosts of heaven to bring God's justice. Let's keep going. Verse 9 says, "When you hear wars and uprisings, don't be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away." So what is the end coming referring to? It's actually not referring to the end of all things. In other words, the second coming of Christ. The end coming is, again, regarding back to the destruction of the temple. So the end coming is returning to that destruction specifically. Think about the wars and rumors of wars. I hear this kind of quoted commonly these days as symbols of Jesus' second coming. They may be, perhaps they are. But Jesus is talking about in a time where there wasn't cell phones or emails or news outlets. So when this was a very real reality. When a city was attacked by Rome during the Jewish-Roman wars, then some travelers from that city or refugees would come down to another city and say, we've been attacked, or I heard this Antioch has fallen, I've heard, and they would start talking about these wars or rumors of wars about cities and uprisings of places that were attacked. And that is just how the information was spread in that time. The Jewish-Roman war, now I'm not going to go into it more here because I did already in Luke 17. Luke 17:20, look up that sermon online if you want to know more. That time was just a time of great hostility, and it took years to develop that war process in which the Jews were systematically conquered, started in northern Jerusalem, and then northern Israel, and then traveled all the way to Jerusalem. In verse 10 it says, when he said to them, nation will rise again, and then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes, famines, and pestilence in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. In summary, this is what was actually happening in the Jewish-Roman war. Not only was there strife outside of Rome, but also there was rumblings within. The Emperor Nero in 68, in the middle of the Jewish-Roman war, he actually committed suicide, and then what followed from his death was a succession of 4 emperors. And believe it or not, at this point, this is all more or less fine for the disciples. Nothing that Jesus has said is really exceptionally bad news. It's all bad news, but it's not exceptionally bad news for the disciples. It's obviously alarming, but nothing especially related to him related to them until now. Take a look at verse 12. This is where everything sort of shifts, and Jesus begins to prepare them. He says, but before all this, before we get to the total destruction of Jerusalem, they, that is the Jews and the Romans, you know it's the Jews because the synagogue is involved here, the Jews and the Romans will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison. And you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on the account of my name. How does that sound? Seized, persecuted, put into prison, brought as one accused before kings and governors. That does sound like a really rough road ahead. Not just for the nation now, especially for Christians. Note this, that Christ's most faithful followers are going to be facing persecution, imprisonment, and more. And this will result not because of their unfaithfulness, but it's actually resulting because of their faithfulness. It will be because they have been faithful. We need to never forget this, okay? Prosperity gospel preachers will all unite to tell me the opposite of this. We never need to forget this, or we need to never forget this, that faithfulness to Christ will not prevent human suffering, Christian suffering. In fact, in some measure, especially in this case, it is because of their faithfulness to Christ that they do suffer. But their faithfulness isn't for nothing, or their suffering is not for nothing in this text. Their suffering has a purpose. In verse 13, we get a part of the answer to that question. What was the purpose? In verse 13, it says, "And you will bear testimony to me." But make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourself. That's so interesting. I just find that so interesting. What people would normally make up their mind beforehand is what to say. And now he's telling them, make up your mind beforehand to not worry about what you're going to say. For I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to contradict. This is our first precious promise in this text. No doubt it's scary, a scary thought to be seized, persecuted, to be put into prison, all because you're a Christian, because you have a testimony about an allegiance to Jesus. But Jesus makes this undeniably clear that they won't have to face it alone. That he will be with them, and not just kind of in that mystical way like I'm with you, but that he was actually going to be empowering their speech so that they will say things that go beyond their understanding, that express a wisdom that not even their adversaries would be able to refute or contradict. He's going to give them that wisdom beyond measure, that beyond Solomonic wisdom, that they can't even resist the words. What a precious promise that is. What a precious promise that whenever you face trouble, you face it because your allegiance to Christ, you don't face it alone. That is good news. And the most eloquent and powerful Lord will go before you, come behind you, and will even work in you to give you the words that you need to speak in the time. So you don't have to worry. I don't know about you, but I would really struggle with that part. I can believe God would come and give me the words, but I'm for sure going to struggle with the worry part. I'm going to be thinking about it all the time. What am I going to say to these guys? How am I going to get off the hook or do something? No, Jesus is saying, don't worry about it beforehand. More bad news comes for the disciples. This is specific to them here. Verse 16, it says, but you will be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, even hate you, or everyone will hate you because of me. What? Betrayed by family, put to death, hated because of your allegiance to Christ? Again, Jesus is not sugarcoating, is he? He's also not saying, hey, come follow me, we're going to have a real nice time, guys. No, he's saying that there's going to be more difficult times ahead for Christians. And this is really where your second precious promise comes in big. In verse 18, he says, but not a hair from your head will perish. That's really easy for me because all my hairs have perished. But Keanu, that would be a bad one for you and your dad, right? That would be a tough one. No. Not a hair of your head will perish. This promise is a real mind bender. Really, Jesus? How is it that you can say on one hand that some of you they will put to death, but none of you will even have a hair of your head that will perish? In what sense, Jesus? In what sense? I feel like if I perish, my hair perishes. The promise is an exclamation point that no matter what anyone can do to you, burn you alive. Some of you they do, right? Some of them they did. Feed them to lions, so they're lion food. Hang them up on crosses. Whatever else they could think of to do, it ultimately won't matter because 100% of them, Jesus is saying, will be preserved and in glory be resurrected and vindicated. That not even a single hair of their head will have been lost. People have wondered, and this is a total aside, and I don't have time for asides, but I'm going there anyway. This is a total aside, but people have wondered about cremation, What happens to us in the resurrection if our bodies are cremated? Well, if some people were eaten by lions and some people have been eaten by sharks, I'm not sure which one's scarier, and so they were digested and their molecules were absorbed in the shark's body, and sort of you go down that scientific route, you may wonder. But Jesus is saying, hey, don't worry about all that. You cling to my promise that not even a hair of your head will be lost. So even if somebody was cremated. Not a hair of their head would be lost. Everything will be restored in the resurrection. God is powerful enough to do that. Can I get an amen? This is a precious promise because mankind is still inventing new ways to kill people. But there's nothing that they can do to permanently harm us, for our mortal flesh will be clothed with immortality. That is a precious promise. And your body will be raised and nothing will be lost. I will have my hair back. No Rogaine necessary. I know it. I know it's true. I know it's true. Life eternal awaits the faithful who are in Christ Jesus. And so we come to our first encouragement in light of that promise. So he says, because of that, because not even a molecule of your body can be lost, he says, stand firm, verse 19. Stand firm, and you will win life. They may kill you, but you will win life by standing firm throughout the trial. If we're being honest with ourselves, I think most of us wonder, if I were to face anything like what we've described today, if I were to be seized, persecuted, if I were to be put in prison, betrayed by my family, even put to death, hated because of my allegiance to Jesus, would I stay faithful to the end? I mean, I think that that's something that most people or believers wonder. I imagine it would be tempting to deny Christ, tempting to deny him to avoid all of the trouble, all of the pain, all of the hardship. That would be tempting to do. To be identified as Jesus' follower, it's not being pictured very well in this text in this life. But for the life to come, it's painting quite a portrait. No. Jesus would say, stand firm, stand fast, and receive a crown of life that's waiting for you. Jesus is going to provide now a little more information regarding the destruction of the temple with some important details sprinkled in. Take a look at verse 20. He says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Judea is just outside of Jerusalem, so it's going to be impacted when Jerusalem is surrounded. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. This is actually really important information, especially for the early church, who would have needed to hear this information in order to know what to do. This is like a prophetic warning for them. When the Romans finally do make their way to Jerusalem, besiege it, everybody is trapped inside. So foreigners, non-Jews, everybody is trapped inside. Even innocent travelers have nothing to do with the Jewish revolt. Jesus says to the Christians, now think about this possibly in terms of our nationalism. To the Christians, don't stay and fight. Don't stay and fight. Don't fight for the city. Get out. Think about what that would have said to the Jews of their time. It's very similar to Jeremiah's message to Jerusalem when they were being overrun by the Babylonians, when they were knocking at the door. He was, of course, telling the Israelites to stop fighting, to surrender, to give up, to allow the Babylonians to win, because God has already delivered the city over to the Babylonians. It just isn't realized yet. So don't fight. But Israel did fight back, and because they did, it was much worse for them. Thousands of people died unnecessarily. And so Jesus is giving them this kind of Jeremiah-like message, which isn't going to be popular because they're going to think, this is our homeland, we need to fight. This is our inheritance, we need to fight. And he's saying, no, when the Romans come, get out. Head for the hills. Get out. Don't go into the city. Flee for your lives. In verse 22 it says, for this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all has been written. How dreadful it will be for those in those days for the pregnant women and the nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath because against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken prisoners to all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. All this has already happened. That's my approach to be perfectly clear. Already, all of this has already taken place. None of this is future prophecy. All of this has already taken place. It was fulfilled in 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed, and all of those who were pregnant at the time really suffered as they were fleeing. But here I see a shift. Here I see future. Here I see a distinction. There's a shift happening. We're moving ahead in time now to the last days. The time of the Gentiles was birthed at that time, or since Jesus, essentially after the destruction of the temple, the Gentiles essentially took possession of the temple and the Temple Mount, and continues till this day. And so it seems like we are still in the time of the Gentiles. And so this is where I think that this is moving toward the future. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint in terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. This is the final of the precious promises in this text. The Son of Man will come again. The Son of Man will come again in the clouds with great power and with great glory. And he will bring the church into the time of her redemption. This will be a time of vindication of all past believers and present. He will judge the kingdoms of the earth with power for their wickedness, and will bring his kingdom to fullness on earth as it is in heaven. And this is a precious promise, the glorious appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ. And I'm sure some, as I've preached through this text, this is a difficult text, as I hope you realize, that some may disagree with a point here or there on this. Depends on your end times view. I'm a millennial, so I'm not ashamed of that. And I'll admit that. But I think that nobody will disagree with what the main point of this message is. The main point of what Jesus is saying, and the main thing that he's trying to drive home, is that he wants his followers to be ready. To be ready not just for his second coming, but to be ready to face dark times, to be faced with difficult decisions, to be faced with persecution, imprisonment, and worse. But he wants to equip them, not just to prepare them, not just to face those things, but to equip them with promises and assurances that they can remain faithful and steadfast, to not try and weasel out or try and get out of the situations, but to stand firm within them so that they will receive the crown of life. That their eternity is secure. For what? For what? It's a common excuse that you hear these days from apostates. For what? You may hear it on Facebook Shorts, if you ever watch those, Instagram Shorts, YouTube Shorts, all of those. If you ever see critics of Christianity, you almost always run across this person. For what? For what? And it's an excuse that people will give for leaving their faith. Do you know what an apostate is? An apostate is a one-time follower of Christ who renounces their following Christ. So a friend or a family member who is proud of their allegiance to Jesus, only to one day say, you know what, I don't believe any of that anymore. It's all malarkey. That's an apostate. For what, they'll say. For what? I followed Jesus for 10 years of my life. I struggled and I did everything I was supposed to do, and he didn't give me anything. My friends who didn't give a thought about God, they're living the fun life. They're all succeeding in business. They're all succeeding in their life. They're married and happy and all of this. And I follow Jesus and my life is misery. They have all the fun. For what? But when you really regard what Jesus is saying in this text, you kind of got to take stock about what it means to truly follow him. That Jesus made no allusions to his followers that their life would be easy for following him. In fact, he did the exact opposite. He said that in this life you will have trouble, and he outlined some very realistic things that were in the near future for them and how they would have trouble. But then he encouraged them to stand firm even in that trouble, even if it meant to give up your life, because of what lay beyond it is so much more real and more worth it. On one hand, to those apostates, they're right. Make no mistake, they're right. If you want an easy life, don't follow Jesus. If you want it to be comfortable, if you want to result in material blessings, you want what people clamor for in this life, maybe following Jesus isn't the right choice. If you take him at his word, we could expect that we could be seized, persecuted, put into prison. We could be betrayed by our families. We could be put to death. We could be hated by everyone for our allegiance to him. But you know what? By God's amazing kindness and grace to us, we almost never experience that, do we? It's not because God owes us anything. It's definitely not because we're more faithful than those around the world who do experience those things. It's just because he's a gracious God and he's giving us the gift of grace. We don't merit it. Oftentimes we are allowed to follow Jesus, and he does fill our life with good things, material blessings and more. If we do experience hardships and trials and the like, he gives us, those promises to sustain us so that we don't have an excuse to step away. At the end of it all, after he does fill our lives with good things, assurances, comfort, strength, hope, the Holy Spirit to guide us, to make us our lives good and joyful, he then brings us firmly into everlasting life. How can we not remain faithful? How can we not? Even if he doesn't bless us with an easy life, a comfortable life, we won't fold. We'll keep going. Even when the trials come, we're going to stay steady because he is good and his love endures forever. Amen?